consent issues, please feel free to let us know, and we can sort of shut off the recording, or if you want to step out, etc., we can. You can do that, obviously, also. All right, so just to check everybody's okay with the session being recorded. Cool, perfect. And Sean will upload it onto YouTube if anybody wants to watch it back, and we will distribute the link when Sean sends it to you guys. All right, thank you everybody for coming along today to this book launch for Sean Dobson's book. It's originally in French, but Sean will be delivering his comments in English today. But if anybody would like to ask questions en français, please feel free to do so. Sean has said that's more than fine. And so I won't take too long to introduce Sean, just very briefly to say that he's currently an author working on several projects. As he said, and he'll go into more detail. This was a bit of a sidetrack project, but nevertheless one I think that is quite important given the terrible timeline that we're living through today. And Sean has a background previously having worked in the White House, but also in lots of progressive political activism in a range of institutions, organizations, especially I believe in Minneapolis, was that? No. Progressive Maryland. Most of the US states run. But nevertheless, I will hand over to Sean now because I'm sure you're more interested in hearing from him with regards to the origins of Trumpism and how do we defeat it? How do we sort of challenge Trumpism as a political ideology? All right, Sean.
Well, let me start by giving my thanks to the Geneva Graduate Institute, in particular Professors Bernard Keogh and Aidan Russell. Special shout out to my friend, distinguished alum Mathieu Théa, for also playing a role in bringing together this meeting of minds. And I mean that because my own perspective is that of mostly of an American political activist on the left of center side, and also from a historical standpoint. I have a PhD in history, and I looked in modern European history with a special focus on fascist movements. But I'm thrilled to be talking to you today, and I'd like this to be a discussion, not just me lecturing at you, to get your perspective, since obviously you're coming at it much more from an international perspective, I would imagine. Mr. Press, if you love the talk, you want to buy the book, here's a QR code. And so, as Bernard mentioned, I was working on another book when I stopped, and I had to write this one about a year ago. Out of anguish, my wife and I, who just came in the room, Caroline, had just moved to France, and Trump had just won the election. So, I had to understand this catastrophe, and as the first step toward effective action to combat it. So that's why I wrote the book. And also I wrote it because I noticed the first few months after the election, most of the analyses that I was seeing seemed off the mark to me. And now I'm going to switch into a little bit of reading here. When you think about analysis of, say, Nazism, no competent historian just says it's all because of the magical personality of Adolf Hitler. Likewise, we look at Italian fascism. No one says Benito Mussolini waved a magic wand and suddenly millions of Italians came to adore him. And that's why, and yet there was too much of that in initial analyses, and frankly, ever since then, I've seen too much of that. This obsessive attention on all the weirdness of Donald Trump's personality, as if this guy waved a magic wand and created a movement of 80 million people. So that's why my book focuses much more on his followers. MAGA, Make America Great Again. It's a long durational phenomenon in American history with deep historical roots. And in fact, it already pre-existed Donald Trump. They were just looking for a leader. If he hadn't come along, I think they would have invented something like Donald Trump. He played a role. I'm not saying he didn't, but his peculiarities of personality have been overemphasized, in my opinion. Relatedly, another defect of many of the interpretations I've seen so far is they're ahistorical. They just focus either on Trump's personality or the political maneuverings of the past couple of years, or maybe the last 8 years or so. Whereas when you look at his movement, you can only understand it if you have a long-term historical perspective on the United States. So that's what I set out to try to correct. And my thesis, which we'll get to in a second, really boils down to this. The political battle inside the United States right now essentially equates to a battle of its 19th century against its 20th century for control of the 21st century. That's basically my thesis in a nutshell. And I'll try to make that clearer as to why in a second. I'm going to kind of sprint through my basic argument. to leave as much time as possible for Q&A. If MAGA is not just some fluke of one person, if it does have deep roots, my prediction, my thesis can be tested by a single prediction, namely that even after Trump finally leaves the political stage, the Republican nominee for president in 2028 will not be Donald Trump, because the Constitution simply rules out any more than 2 terms unless he does a full-scale coup d'etat. Will be not a conservative, a traditional Republican conservative. No, it will be a Trumpian far right-winger. And moreover, due to the deep roots of this movement, that right-winger will either win the election or come close to winning, which in the American context means that candidate will get at least 46% of the vote, which in the American context, thanks to our crazy electoral college, puts you within striking distance of winning the electoral college and therefore the White House. So that's the way to test my thesis. If the Republicans get blown out of the water, then I'm wrong. It was just a fluke. It was a one-off. But I don't think they're going to be blown out of the water. I think they're going to get at least 46% of the vote. And we're going to get to these deep roots that explain, for many foreigners, they can't believe that Trumpism and MAGA is so competitive. But when you see these deep roots, you begin to understand why. In that battle to win that election, Democrats are going to have to change a lot of what they've been doing the past 50 years. We'll get into that in a second. Because part of the origins of the catastrophe are the failures of the Democratic Party. And the advanced democracies, and everyone actually abroad, outside the United States, has a role to play as well if you don't like Trumpism. And I'm sorry if some people here are sympathetic to Trumpism or Orbanism or Putinism. I'm assuming most people in this room view it the way I do, which is it's a problem. You all have a role to play, and we're going to get into that as well. The stakes in this battle could not be higher. The United States is not just any country. It's the world's only superpower. If Democrats lose the 2028 presidential election, it could lock in a far-right MAGA dictatorship that would destroy forever the Pax Americana, and this entire institution is a product of the Pax Americana, the United Nations and everything related to it, and reverse long-term American participation in the battle against climate change, which would guarantee global chaos in ways we cannot even imagine. So it's hard to imagine stakes higher than what's right in front of us. Okay, here's the outline of what I'm going to say today. I'm going to race through it so we have as much Q&A as possible. So let's start with part 1, election results. There was at first a lot of nervous clucking that somehow Trump won a landslide and he's created a new multiracial coalition and the Democrats will never win again. It's false. He won by 1.5 percentage points. True, he picked up in nearly every jurisdiction and nearly every demographic category, but it was no blowout. It was a close election. And Harris could have easily won if she won a better campaign. So let's just dispense with that myth right now. It was a close election, and just like the past 5 or 6, and all of them very close, reasonably close, and as well as elections for the United States Congress. In other words, this is not MAGA on its way to ascendancy. This is what's been going on for 20 or 30 years now, which is as the Republican Party radicalizes and goes further right, they don't really lose a lot of votes, and you have a situation of parity. So the Democrats can definitely make a comeback, and they really should. We'll coach them on how in a second. So now let's get to the why. How did he pull this off? Where does his strength come from? After all, his first term was a manifest failure. You think that would have knocked him out of contention, but it didn't. He actually picked up votes, right? He went from 47% up to 50%. He actually gained votes. So my thesis is, as I just said, deep roots in American history, that his movement conforms to many of the traits that govern the United States for most of its long history. What I call the old model, which goes back certainly to 1776, and maybe even to Jamestown, 1607, but let's just start with 1776 as the starting point. Let's look at those traits that formed because black and brown people in the United States had no political rights. The consensus among whites in the United States as to how to govern the United States, regardless of the party in power, be it Federalist, be it Whig, be it Democrat, be it Republican, didn't matter. From 1776 up until about 1901, first 125 years, these were the traits that all whites could agree on. And Trumpism conforms perfectly to it. The first one is white supremacy. And I'm amazed that so many analyses, particularly European analyses, ignore that elephant in the room. They talk about kind of Trumpism as a kind of uprising ignorance, and they call it le populisme, populism. It's like, yeah, there's some of that, there's a lot of ignorance, but it's mostly about white supremacy. What am I talking about? Well, let's start with Europeans when they show up in the United States. What's the first thing they do? They start killing Indians and taking their land, right? And the Indians that didn't die in battlefield deaths died of European diseases. Their land was expropriated. There wouldn't be a United States of America if that didn't happen. At first, it was just pure greed, but very quickly, within just a couple of decades, they formulated a white supremacist ideology to justify the genocidal expropriation. Then after they took all that Indian land, they didn't want to work it themselves. They were too lazy, and instead, they decided they would have someone else do the hard work. They looked around, where can we get some cheap labor around here? The Indians run away or they die. Let's enslave Africans and bring them here. And slavery wasn't just a sector confined to the South. It was far and away, during the colonial period and the early republic, far and away the biggest economic sector in the United States. And Northerners benefited as well. 10% of the population, for example, in New York City was enslaved during the colonial period. Northerners participated in the form of banking, insurance, transportation of slave cargoes, etc. And the consensus wasn't just, slave owners benefiting and therefore all whites were for it, because they all benefited from it. If you were a white worker, manual laborer, well, let's back up. You get off the boat in colonial America or early republic, you're a landless peasant from Scotland or England maybe, or Germany. You need land. That's the first thing you need in a pre-industrial economy. So everyone was, of course, agreed on the expropriation of Indian land. But also the slave economy, everyone benefited because all those enslaved African persons were barred from participation in skilled work, and therefore the good jobs, the skilled ones, went only to white workers. So there's a lot of consensus, and it didn't matter which party was in power. They could all agree on slavery's okay, we're not going to ban it. The United States only finally banned it, only because of the Civil War, a Civil War that broke out not over slavery, but over the comparative detail of its extension to the Western territories, and only to weaken the Confederacy militarily. So Donald Trump, his whole life is like a kind of ode to white supremacy. It looks like his dad was probably a member or sympathizer to the Ku Klux Klan. Trump started his career with a fine from the United States Department of Justice. His father, who ran a real estate company, refused to rent apartments to African Americans. He made his big debut in politics the way he immediately became a star in the Republican Party. He was the leader of the birther movement, claiming that Barack Obama is not really an American, he was born abroad. It was clearly a racist conspiracy theory. They made him a superstar within the GOP. So that definitely conforms to white supremacy. And when you look at his policies, he talks endlessly about immigration. It's poisoning the blood of our nation. Latinos are the big problem. And yet he loves white immigrants. He married two of them after all, right? And his top political consigliere is a white South African immigrant, Elon Musk, or was anyway. Trump says he wants more white immigrants from countries like Norway and South Africa, white South Afrikaners. So immigration is also subsumed under the topic of white supremacy. Another long-term factor, America is a more sexist society than many other advanced societies. I think it cost Kamala Harris, and the proof is we have a very low percentage of female parliamentarians in our Congress compared to, say, Europe. So I think that cost Kamala Harris as well, and it's a long-term phenomenon. It goes back a ways. Another long-term trait of what I call the old model that conforms perfectly to Trumpism is a relaxed attitude about white criminality. That showed up in American history, for example, with downscale whites. Just, a lot of the Indian land was expropriated by informal measures. Bands of white settlers would simply arm themselves and go out west and just take Indian land. And it was against the law, it violated treaties, but they never got in trouble for it. In fact, the federal troops would rescue them when necessary. It also took the form of, robber barons, Wall Street chicanery. So that's definitely, white folks can break the law, and Donald Trump proves it. He's a 34-count felon who nonetheless has never gone to prison, and in fact, he's in the White House right now. Even our Supreme Court, has a relaxed attitude about white criminality. They've all been caught taking multi-million-dollar bribes, which they call gifts from their friends, but they're from special interest groups with business before the court. And they've decided a whole bunch of decisions that are plainly illegal and unconstitutional. So another long-term trait of the old model that conforms to Trumpism is anti-intellectualism. That's a key thing to understand about American history. If you go to high school in the United States, the heroes are the athletes, right? And the smart kids are the nerds. It's always been that way. Ignorance is seen as makes you authentic somehow, and you're not one of those fancy intellectuals and fancy elites. So that's a long-term trait in American history. For example, there was a mass movement in the 19th century called the Know-Nothing Party. What other advanced country would have a Know-Nothing Party, right? Only the United States. And even today, American students score worse among advanced countries on standardized tests. Another long-term trait of the old model that governed America for the first 125 years, and again, Trump embodies it, is unilateralism in foreign policy, bellicose unilateralism. Too many analysts describe Trump as an isolationist, right? It's not true. That's a misnomer. It's bellicose unilateralism. That's a long-term American tenet of American foreign policy. You could say it started maybe with the Monroe Doctrine. President Monroe telling the Europeans, no, only the United States can pillage the Americas. And then a series of just endless unilateral wars of choice. Endless war against native nations west of the Appalachians, Spanish-American War, Mexican-American War, War of 1812. These were all wars that the United States started, basically. And then in our own century, or the 20th century, I should say, a lot of further wars like that. Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, and today I think we're in another one, right? In Iran. So it's a long-term trait, and Trump certainly embodies it. So all these found their perfect expression at the very end of the 19th century in the administration of William McKinley, who embodied this. And it's no accident that Donald Trump singled out McKinley in his inaugural address as his lodestar, the lodestar of his administration. And he said, McKinley, is a great president, and we're going to be following his example of high tariffs, which is another example of unilateralism, imposing high tariffs on trading partners. Okay, so that's the old model. It began to crack. I think it's time to go back to our outline here. Decline of the old model. It began to chip and crack because white Americans had a falling out along class lines and along gender lines, beginning at the turn of the century. Along class lines, poorer whites became increasingly impatient at the high cost of living, artificially jacked up by the federal government's embrace of monopolies. And so they began to demand that the monopolies be broken up. And Republican electeds could see, okay, our base is getting unruly here, we're going to have to give them something. So Teddy Roosevelt began to break up some of the monopolies, but not all of them. Another example, another crack in the old model happened at about that same time, when more and more poor whites began demanding institution of a graduated progressive federal income tax as the main way to pay for government. Up until then, the main method had been through tariffs, which of course jacks up the price of goods. And so finally, the Republican elites decided they would give in on that as well, and they agreed to institute a federal income tax as well. A final crack developed with the powerful suffragist movement in the streets, demanding that women get the right to vote. And so that was an example of a slight retreat on the long durational trait of sexism that defined the old model. They had to give into that one because the suffragist movement had too much power. So it began to decline, and what you got is a more progressive kind of comeback, and the two models, starting from 1901 until 1932, were kind of at parity. An example being Woodrow Wilson, who was right-wing in many respects, but he put another crack in the old model when he departed from unilateralism and instead joined the Entente powers in World War I, and then right after that, played the leading role in the peace conference in Versailles. So that was an example of multilateral diplomacy. So the old model is beginning to crack in the early 20th century, and then 1929 finished it off, because clearly this model could not govern an advanced capitalist country in a depression. And it just went, it became fully eclipsed at that point. And it turned the Democratic Party from minority party into a kind of permanent majority party, in effect, for the rest of the 20th century, or at least for a generation. And then, you know, from my standpoint, those were some very good decades. We had the New Deal. The United States, you know, played an indispensable role in World War II. Thereafter, the United States, I think, followed an overall wise foreign policy with plenty of mistakes along the way, but basically, the Pax Americana overall was a positive thing, I think, and exercised through multilateral institutions a lot like this one, right? And it was decades, 40 years or so, of unprecedented peace and prosperity, really. I mean, plenty of horror stories along the way, but still, overall, this was pretty much the work of the Democratic Party, with Republicans agreeing on the anti-communist part. So the Cold War, the Republicans reluctantly agreed to depart from unilateralism and embrace that only because they didn't like communism, godless communism. They didn't really care about democracy and promoting democracy, they just wanted to fight Soviet godless communism. So that was then basically get you to about 1968 or so, with what I call the new model. Essentially, you could say domestically, no matter how imperfectly, tending toward multiracial social democracy. Black and brown folks get the right to vote. Women's rights are enshrined in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, desegregation of schools, massive investments in public schools, infrastructure, things of that nature. So at home, kind of tending toward multiracial social democracy, and abroad toward multilateralism in the service of anti-totalitarianism, be it fascism in the 1940s or communism after 1945. So that's kind of what characterized the new model. Trump and his people don't agree with any of that stuff, right? But they were just completely knocked out. The Republican elites were going along with at least half of it, and people like him were very much sidelined for an entire generation. But here's the key point: they didn't disappear. They didn't disappear. They were eclipsed, but not extinguished by the new model. The old model persisted in the form of, for example, Charles Lindbergh's America First Committee, which is a mass movement. 30 million listeners each week to Father Coughlin's far right-wing radio broadcasts in the 1930s. The John Birch Society, presidential campaign of Barry Goldwater. The old model persisted, but it was sort of under the radar and out of power, but it was there. What brought it back into a competitive posture was beginning during that same era of Democratic Party ascendancy. The Democrats went along with some policies that began to really hurt working families, basically, in a nutshell. And let's get to some of those policies now. This helps explain the comeback of Trumpism, or I should say the comeback of the old model in the guise of Trumpism. And anyone have any questions yet? Or just, you want me to just finish the presentation, then we can turn over to discussion? All right, let's just finish off the presentation. How am I doing on time, Bernard? Are we okay?
Yeah, we're doing fine. Keep going.
Okay, so there's a bipartisan consensus in favor of policies, even at the high noon of the new model, of basically the New Deal coalition, that began to hurt regular Americans, regardless of skin color, downscale Americans, working class Americans, white, black, and brown. And the first factor was nonstop wars of choice, which only poor boys fought in and never rich boys. So it started with Korea. I know today maybe a lot of people think that was a smart war to fight, but at the time it made no sense from an American national security standpoint. and Korea didn't matter in those days. Vietnam War, obviously, repeated interventions in Central America, too many to count. Iraq War, Afghanistan was a mistake. Obviously, we didn't need to put boots on the ground there. We should have just bombed them from the air. And now, as we speak, yet another war, right? Iran. And plenty of other police actions. Only poor kids went to go fight them. They were basically cannon fodder in the military-industrial complex. And it didn't do anything to contain the Soviet Union. These wars, they were stupid. So that was the first factor that began to alienate working class Americans, and in particular turn white workers from just conservatives into reactionaries. That was one factor that did it. The next factor was one that was unavoidable and positive and needed to happen, but it also helped to radicalize white America, namely the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. It left a bad taste in the mouth of at least half of white Americans, and probably most of them, certainly the downscale ones. They didn't like it, you know, they just didn't think black people should have civil rights. I mean, they're racist. And that conforms then to the long-term trait of white supremacy that has stamped the American experiment from the start. So it began, and you see the proof of that in immediately after enactment of the 1965 Civil Rights Act. Immediately, there was a huge hemorrhage of white working class support for the Democratic Party. In droves, they went away, they abandoned the Democratic Party and went to two places. The Republican Party, and down south, they went to Dixiecrat George Wallace. And the proof is that the 1968 election, the Democratic nominee dropped from 61%, which is what LBJ got in 1964, all the way down to 43%. Hubert Humphrey lost 18 percentage points in only 4 years, even though the economy was roaring, right? And also, discussed with the Vietnam War, have not yet reached a crescendo. So the only way to explain that hemorrhage of white working class support was the Civil Rights Revolution. They didn't like it. So that was another reason for the radicalization of the white working class, which in turn radicalized the GOP, because that's where most of their votes come from. And you see the proof of that in ever more right-wing Republican presidential nominees over that same time period. So, for example, Nixon in 1968 was much more right-wing than Eisenhower had been. Then Reagan was much more right-wing than Nixon had been. Then George W. Bush was much more right-wing than Reagan. And now Trump is much more right-wing than W. It's a radicalization process, skewing to the right and driven mostly by the base of the party. That doesn't mean elites didn't play a role, though. Republican elites inadvertently, I think, created a Frankenstein's monster in Trumpism, in that they too began to massively fund conservative infrastructure to try to roll back the regulatory state, creating a bunch of think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, Fox News, basically industrial strength spewers of right-wing propaganda, professionally produced. What they didn't realize is that they were not just helping Republicans to win, but they were also helping radicalize the Republican base. All this setting up a vehicle that Donald Trump could eventually ride to the White House. And the final, there's other factors here in the last 40 years that helped to radicalize white working class Americans, but the last one was a bipartisan embrace of neoliberalism. I define that as deregulation of the economy, ever freer trade, and ever looser immigration rules. Free movement of basically goods and persons across frontiers. Let's look at each in turn. Deregulation did the most damage. Basically, they just kind of let big corporations run wild, and the Democrats were completely complicit in all this. They had no problem with it. The result is, in the last 40 years in the United States, all the fruits of economic growth, all of it, has been going into the pockets of only the top 1%. It's that simple. That did most of the damage. Looser rules on Wall Street, for example, mostly deregulating whole sectors of the economy, like telecom, trucking, shipping, things like that. Free trade also was a bipartisan consensus. And Democrats were fully down with that. It was Clinton, after all, who pushed China WTO. And I'll just pause and note my own deep regret. I was working in the White House at that time, and I worked a lot on that issue. And at the time, I knew this isn't right. It's going to be a flood of Chinese imports. It's going to be political hell to pay here. But I went along with it because I was young and ambitious, and I regret that bitterly. But free trade played a secondary role in depressing the standard of living of workers, and in a particular way. The economists of all stripes kind of agree on this, actually, that the flood of Chinese goods in particular really hurt, in particular, middle-sized Midwestern industrial cities, where if they lose their big factory, it's a catastrophe for the whole town, and the tax base collapses, the public schools go downhill, they have to lay off police officers, people move away. Those voters in the industrial Midwest were exactly the ones that powered Donald Trump to the White House in all of his election bids. So, if you treat these workers poorly, you got to remember, they get to vote. And when they vote, they're going to vote for far right-wing candidates. So something to keep in mind. And then immigration, which is a complex topic. I'm the grandson of immigrants. Right now, I'm an immigrant living in France. I believe in, a healthy amount of immigration. But the United States, we went too far. We just lost control of our southern border. It's that simple. And there's a lot of happy talk about, isn't it wonderful, this diversity? Yeah, it's great. But some of the immigrants were, in fact, taking good paying jobs for native-born Americans. For example, in the construction industry. Go to any construction site in the United States, any construction site anywhere, and you'll see the same thing. Nothing but Latino workers, all speaking Spanish. They have all the unskilled and semi-skilled jobs. Those are good paying jobs. There's no doubt a lot of native-born Americans would want those jobs. Millions and millions of those jobs. That said, I don't pretend that that immigration played a major role in all this. Mostly it was deregulation. But it certainly powered, and it didn't play a big role in Kamala's loss in the election. It turned out immigration was like the 5th most important issue according to opinion polls. But it was the key to Trump getting control of the Republican Party. That's all he ever talked about, and that's all the Republican base cared about, because they don't want brown people, Latinos, and Asian people coming into the United States. It was that simple. So it definitely helped him get control of the Republican Party and make it his personal political vehicle. So let's look at more shorter-term causes, and then we'll have a discussion here. I'm going to ignore this part on international phenomenon. Basically, foreign influences could not have played a causal role in Trumpism for a simple reason. The people who love Donald Trump the most have no idea what's happening outside the United States. So they wouldn't even know about Hitler or Mussolini, just vaguely, and they certainly don't know about Orban or Putin or any of that stuff. So it couldn't have played a causal role. That said, I do think Trumpism is a manifestation, an American manifestation of a broader phenomenon, which in the United States is called illiberal democracy. But I think in Europe they're calling it populism. Like, what would you call Urbanism? Is there a moniker for that?
Far right-wing populism?
Far right-wing populism? Okay. I think that the moniker in the United States at this point is illiberal democracy. Definitely Trump is part of that, it's a manifestation of it, but it wasn't caused by it. Okay, so let's look at the short-term factors of Trump's victory. In the last 4 years, inflation was a killer. None of you grew up in an inflationary era, but I remember it as a kid in the 1970s. It was the #1 issue, and it brought down 3 presidents in a row in the United States. They were all one-termers because of inflation. It's just a killer. Everyone can agree that they hate inflation, whether you're a worker or a capitalist, rich, poor, everyone can agree on that. In the United States, just like in everywhere else, it was a pandemic-related phenomenon. It was caused by the pandemic. It spiked to about 9%, and it made people really mad. And they just blamed Biden for it, basically. It wasn't his fault, it's the pandemic, but they blamed him. That's what happens, the incoming gets blamed for it. So that was one short-term factor that helped Trump. Another one was Biden was just too old for the job. He was doddering, he was senile, and couldn't put him in front of the cameras because he was so senile. So that was part of it as well. And he didn't pull out of the presidential election in time to give Kamala Harris a chance to really introduce herself to the American voters. And the final short-term factor is Harris's campaign. She raised a lot of money. She won her only debate against Trump, true. She can deliver a script very well, true. But her scripts were terrible because they didn't deal with the top issue that all the opinion polls were showing was far and away the most important, namely inflation. She just didn't want to talk about it for some reason. I don't know why, but anyway, and she decided her main strategy would be to try to win over moderate Republicans, which was futile because, as we've seen before, the long durational white supremacy in America guarantees that you can't win Republicans over. You just can't get them. They're loyal, you know, and mostly it's because of racism, basically. They're just totally loyal, and that's why Trump never fell below 46%, and the next Republican nominee will also get at least 46%. If you want to beat the Republicans, it's about turning out your own base, and Harris didn't even try to do that, really. She invested a lot of money in the mechanisms of voter turnout, but no attempt to motivate her base to vote for her, and above all, she didn't talk about inflation. So as a result, you can't physically prod people to the polls if they don't feel motivated. She didn't do that. So she ran overall a pretty bad campaign. And nevertheless, she only lost by 1.5 percentage points. So Trump was a very beatable candidate. He definitely could have been beaten. Okay, so I think let's go to conversation now. How to defeat Trumpism, of course, right? So I think the outside world has a role to play. I'm pleased to see Europeans taking steps toward understanding that the United States is no longer a reliable leader of, or even member of NATO, right? Obviously, Trump loves Putin. He admires Putin. He wants to institute Putinism in America, right? And so does the Republican base. It's a startling document. You probably all read it, the United States official foreign policy document of 2025, where it turns out you're the big problem facing the United States. According to Trump's official written foreign policy, it's Western Europe that's the problem, and not Putin, because you're all guilty of civilizational erasure, because you're letting too many non-Europeans immigrate into Europe. So you're public enemy number one now in the eyes of Donald Trump. So obviously you need to do more, and I'm assuming most of the people in here, let's see, I'll show of hands. How many people are European in this room? Okay, most are European, all right. So obviously you need to do more to defend yourselves. You can't rely on the United States anymore. It has to be a European-led NATO alliance. The Americans are unreliable. Democrats are only going to win half the time for the foreseeable future because of the strength of Trumpism. These deep historical roots guarantee that these people will always be competitive in elections. So that's step one. And I think you're beginning to step up now and not get bullied on tariffs. Trump didn't honor his agreement with you, and the whole question of tariffs is kind of up in the air at this point. But to the extent the Americans slap tariffs on you, I hope you reciprocate and maybe go one step further and penalize them for promoting global warming, right? That's an unfair trade advantage they have, spewing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I hope you penalize them for that in your trade agreements. So that's a role you can play. And obviously, though, the heavy lifting has to be by Americans, and the Democratic Party in particular. We have to eschew the mistakes the Democrats, and I say we because I'm a Democrat myself, have been making these past 50 years. We have to get rid of these nonstop wars of choice. We have to stop doing that, and we have to break our addiction to neoliberalism. And really try to make sure that working people are not just thrown under the bus. And in the shorter term, we also have to avoid the mistakes that Kamala Harris made in her campaign. We can't nominate her. She's not a good candidate. And the mistakes she made of trying to win over Republicans. It's a fool's errand. You can't win them over. They're loyal to the GOP because they like the open racism now of the GOP. They love it. They adore it. They're addicted to it. You can't win them over. Instead, you've got to turn out your own base, and that means focusing, in my opinion, more on bread and butter economic issues that will ensure that working families get their fair share of GDP. So anyway, that's my presentation. That's a summary of my book. How much time do we have now for Q&A?
We have until about 1:30, but we can go a little bit over because we have the room for longer. But I guess first off, let's thank Sean for this. And of course, thank you for the comprehensive coverage of Trumpism as a kind of historical and contemporary phenomenon, right? So the long roots, as you said, breakouts of Trumpism, and obviously I would encourage everybody to get a copy of the book if you can. As Sean has mentioned, you can scan the QR code, I believe, to get a copy of the book. But obviously the standard...
It's in French. It's in French.
It's in French, yeah, but I suspect most of you here can read French. But anyways, so as with most international history and politics events, the first rule is that people without PhDs cannot ask questions first. So Aidan and I have ruled ourselves out from asking the first question, and so it is up to all of you. Does anybody have any questions for Sean? Please.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. So I did raise my hand when you began, but full disclosure, I'm also American.
Okay.
As well.
You feel my pain? Okay.
Yeah, so I do. So I guess my question is, if you look ahead to the 2028 elections, there's two kind of trends that are coming out in terms of analysis that I'd love to hear your take on. So one, last year, there was an analysis by the New York Times where the country as a whole is, if you analyze elections, is becoming more conservative. So as you rightly pointed out, Republican presidents are going more to the right, but the country as well is voting more to the right. If you look at and they did a fascinating analysis.
When was that about?
It was last year.
Okay.
I can try and dig it out.
No, I think I remember it. I remember it.
And then the second is, as you pointed out, Trump has been very crafty in some ways in picking up the voters of depressed industrial areas. Now, part of also what's coming out in the analysis is the Democrats don't have a strategy to win those voters back, and that's part of the problem as well.
Yeah, that analysis, I didn't really agree with it. In any event, it's about a year old at this point, and I think it's been superseded. There's no tectonic ideological shift in the United States going on. I think it's still a situation of parity. I don't think the Democrats have to run to the right. Mamdani, for example, is a socialist, right? But that's New York City. I do think, though, on cultural issues, maybe, election time, maybe it's not such a great idea to be talking about transgender bathroom rights. If you want to win the election, maybe that's a losing issue. So some of these more cultural issues on the far left of the spectrum is probably something where Democrats can at least decide, I'm not saying change their positions, but maybe be more strategic about how and when they talk about it. But on economic issues, I think they should move to the left and talk about the big issue now that the polling is showing is affordability, right? Now, what I love about that is it's a kind of broad category that can encompass a Mamdani, who's a socialist and has very kind of systematic policies to deal with that, or more moderate Democrats can simply talk about how we need to bring prices down. So let's stick to, you hear James Carville, it's the economy, stupid, right? That's his number one saying. Election time, it's the economy, stupid. Just talk about the economy, and above all, prices, and how we're going to make things more affordable for you and your family, and keep it basic like that. And let's talk a little bit less about transgender bathroom rights and things of that nature at election time. As far as the industrial communities go, and the Democrats don't have a plan for that, yeah, and so they're going to have to put forward how they're going to revive these communities, right? And I'm a big believer in a very ambitious Green New Deal, right? That would create a lot of good paying jobs for working class families and help the transition to a sustainable economy that's not based on fossil fuels. And that would create a lot of jobs and could create them very quickly. For example, if you insulated every single building in America, right? I mean, that would be a lot of jobs that you couldn't ship to China, for example. Those would be American jobs. So that's what I would advise them to do, an ambitious Green New Deal. And if you got to worry about how to pay for it, why don't we institute a wealth tax? Just go 1% on all millionaires. Wealth, not income, wealth. And that would pay for it. So, that would be my prescription. Let's keep it on economic stuff, affordability, an abundance agenda, an affordability agenda. And let's beam that into the industrial Midwest to the extent we can.
Grace, other questions, please?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I have a question regarding like more gender issue. I would say regarding the election of Trump, I wanted to ask, like, because I've heard that many women have voted for him, but as we all know, it's not known for being a feminine follower or whatever. So how could you explain that?
Yeah, he picked up some more female votes compared to 2020, but it wasn't like a tidal wave. Kamala Harris still got more, but Kamala Harris, even though she's a woman, and even though Donald Trump had just taken away a federal right to abortion, and even though he's a convicted sexual predator, despite all that, Kamala Harris, who's a woman after all, she got less female votes than Joe Biden did in 2020. So that's really kind of dismaying. Is it because women are suddenly becoming like sexist themselves, these self-haters? No, I think the election was decided by an issue not related to gender in this case. It was decided by inflation. Inflation was the key issue. So most women are working class, and they can see they're having trouble putting food on the table for their family, having trouble paying their rent, having trouble making their car payments, and inflation is killing them. And so they saw the Democrats as the incumbent party. They're responsible for inflation. I'm going to punish them, and I'm going to vote for Trump. I think that explains it. But it is dismaying, though, to think that basically a rapist who just took away the right to abortion gets more female votes than he had 4 years earlier. It's sobering. Yes, sir.
From the European perspective, it seems like the Democrats have been unable to, in the past year, to really build up an opposition and, pull out 1 or 2, 3 leadership figures. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a mess. I can't understand. I mean, there's 2 people who could play that role. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries in the House of Representatives. Why in the world aren't they having a daily press conference, the 2 of them standing next to each other, to deliver the Democratic message, right? But they don't do that. Instead, they just kind of send out random tweets and put out random press releases. Sometimes they'll appear together. So it's a mess. But, there's lots of examples of Democrats basically screwing up until the last minute. And then once they nominate someone in the primary, things get a lot better. Remember also that, excuse me, we're benefiting also from the Republicans screwing up a lot themselves. So even if the Democrats are incompetent, you're up against an opponent who's crazy, right? And the Republicans are just insane. I mean, just pick up a newspaper and read the headlines. You're amazed at what you read, they're going to make they're in the process of making a lot of mistakes, and they're going to make a lot more between now and Election Day. And even the Democrats are kind of not bringing their A game and bringing their B game. They can still win, definitely. And that's kind of been the history of American politics, really. Republican craziness opens the door to Democrats, and Democrats just kind of stumble through it. That's basically how our elections work, mostly.
Further questions?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'm not entirely sure how to best phrase this question, but you mentioned that one of the ways to defeat Trumpism would be for Democrats to kind of get rid of this addiction to neoliberalism and kind of propose an economic package that is more left-leaning, or at least closer to the working class. And my question is, well, in the context of how kind of American politics work and like the interests that fuel American politics, so how you have singular Democratic candidates who are funded by the corporations most of the time. It's not secondary that they actually embrace this neoliberalism. It didn't happen by chance. It happened because they followed like the interests of their funders. So would you say that in the system of the US right now, as it is, this is even a possibility?
That's a great question. In the book, I get into it. I kind of truncated my presentation here, but you're absolutely right. A huge reason the Democrats went along with the neoliberal agenda of the past 50 years, a huge reason is that in the United States, we really don't have any campaign finance limits. It's just anything goes, you know? I give you $1 million and then talk to you about my bill that's in your committee. I mean, it's totally legal. So yeah, it is, who can give $1 million? Obviously, it's the big corporations and wealthy individuals. And what's their perspective? Well, they're not economic populists, are they? They believe in neoliberalism. So that's exactly a huge problem. And yeah, that would have to go at the centerpiece of a democratic agenda, which is fundamental campaign finance reform. And the only way you're going to accomplish that, though, is you're going to have to get more progressives onto the Supreme Court. Because the Supreme Court has decided in a series of cases, the most fundamental of which was Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, that money equals speech. So if I give you a politician, I give you a campaign contributions, that's protected free speech. It's a form of speech, according to the Supreme Court. So if that's true, you cannot have campaign finance reform then, because it's protected by the First Amendment. So the Democrats have to figure a way to knock down that Supreme Court decision, and the only way it's going to happen is, in my opinion, is they're going to have to expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court, which until very recently was considered a radical step. But I'm all for it. You know, we're up against an opponent who is ruthless, and you know, we're in a knife fight, okay? And we can't be playing by gentlemen's rules anymore. We're in a knife fight, and the first thing they ought to do, if they have the votes in the Senate, is expand the number of seats on the Supreme Court from 9 up to 13, I would say, and put 4 Democrats in there. Then you can nullify all those terrible Supreme Court decisions, the worst of which was Buckley versus Vallejo, but also Citizens United and others as well. Campaign finance is a peculiarity of the American political system. We don't have any limits, really. I think we're the only advanced country that's like that. Maybe Australia also, I'm not sure. The Australians are kind of loose about campaign finance, or?
No, it's pretty strange. And
Is it
also,
stringent?
We have a electoral commission, which is a nice thing, an external third party that actually checks on election integrity, unlike in the United States, whereby there's no federal election commission, as I understand it. It's sort of on a state and municipal level, which complicates things when they can also declare for political parties.
Okay, so the United States is just all by itself in our weird attitude that money equals speech. Yeah.
All right, further questions?
Yes, sir.
You talked about that the Harris campaign, or generally the Democrat campaigns, should focus on mobilizing Democrats instead of trying to win over Republicans. And this is just more based on hearsay than actual statistical numbers, but I feel like a part of why Harris wasn't able to mobilize or lost votes was the issue of Democrat position towards Israel. And there seemed to be a certain number of young people who went out, protested, who saw the Israeli policy as something that they don't want to support, and were angry that, I guess, Biden didn't do as much as they hoped. And I heard of cases, and as I said, I don't have concrete numbers, but where there was people who were in favor of Democrats, either abstained from voting, or actually went as far as voting for Trump as a protest vote. And so what is the possibility and the likelihood that the Democrats might take a more critical approach to the current Israeli administration?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I have 2 nephews, both in their 20s, young hipsters in Brooklyn, you know, extremely liberal. And I think one of them just refused to vote for Harris because of what Biden had done, just completely backing up Netanyahu in the slaughter of Palestinian civilians. Yeah, it's a problem. And the Democratic Party historically has been very reflexively pro-Israel and willing to give any Israeli government whatever they want. But at this point, I can tell you the base of the party, a huge majority, in fact, opinion polls show it, like 80% of the rank and file Democrats want a complete and total rethink of our Israeli policy. However, there are powerful elected Democrats who are still very much tied to the old way of thinking. And getting back to your point about campaign finance reform, there's a very powerful political group called AIPAC. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, AIPAC. They funnel millions and millions of dollars into elections to ensure that Democrats and Republicans will only elect extreme pro-Israel candidates. So it's important for Democrats to just simply declare war on AIPAC and make AIPAC the problem, I would say. In other words, if we're not going to get their money, let's turn them into the demon. I would demonize AIPAC, basically. We maybe saw a first step just last night. Governor Gavin Newsom of California, he actually used the word apartheid to describe the Israeli regime. That's incredible. Like, that never would have happened 2 or 3 years ago. It's an incredible statement. Governor of California and at this point, the leading contender for the Democratic nomination for president would call Israel an apartheid state. I mean, whoa, that's a big change. So I think change is coming, and it can't happen soon enough because, look at this war in Iran, right? Who's the beneficiary here? Does this serve American interests in any way, right? There's only one winner here. And once again, we're letting the tail wag the dog, right? Israel's supposed to be our client state. They're supposed to do what we tell them to do. No, it's the other way around. They tell us what to do. And then the United States military does the hard work for them. So yeah, and more Democrat. Here's a good example. I'm a Democratic Party insider. I live in Washington. I used to live in Washington, D.C. I was in that world, right? I would have said that publicly 10 years ago. I would say it with my friends, man. But if I was at a cocktail party in Washington, what I just said, Israel is a strategic liability of the United States. It's the tail wagging the dog. We need a divorce from Israel. I wouldn't have said that just because I would be worried about my career. It would hurt me. I would think it, but I wouldn't say it. Whereas now people like me are willing to say it, and in fact, it's going to go on YouTube when I upload that video. Hello, yes, I think Israel is a strategic liability of the United States, and we need a divorce and a rethink. Okay, it's official. So that just shows you there's a big change among Democratic Party insiders. Yeah.
Hang on, we had two hands here first, and then let's just go down the track. You had your hand up as well.
Me too.
Yes.
Yeah, you kind of answered my question, so it's fine.
Great. And then I think Armand, you had your hand up earlier, so you go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering about, I think we've seen a wave of insurgent candidates, kind of anti-establishment candidates in the Democratic Party over the last couple of years, and how you see these...
Anti-Semitic?
No, anti-establishment.
Oh, establishment, right.
No. Anti-establishment candidates going up against what you were describing with Chuck Schumer from Jeffries, and how you see that both painting the future of the Democratic Party and also their role in the 2028 and 2026 elections.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see a changing of the guard generalized within the Democratic Party. It's like the party leadership is gerontocratic. Biden was obviously an old, doddering old fool who should have been retired. Chuck Schumer is now almost 8 years old, right? And these older ones are oftentimes also more conservative among Democrats. And you're seeing younger challengers emerge. And part of that challenge is going to be about Israel and where the party stands on Israel, among other issues. That said, you have to remember though, the United States is a big country, really big. And there's no one size fits all for Democrats. If you're running as a Democrat, say in a suburb, a white suburb, you're going to have a different campaign than someone running, say, in an inner city. So there's no one size fits all. And yet you are seeing this kind of changing the guard, and it's generational, but also ideological. Yeah.
If we watch the data of the recruitment, let's say, of the army of the United States, we can watch that all the white people that are recruited by the United States come from the southern state, and like from the article that I read, especially from like the classical Republican family. But how the Republican Party justify the death of their son that are sent to Middle East for dying against Israel? How the MAGA Party, that also historically racist and against you, can accept that their son died for the Israel state in the Middle East?
That's a key question. Trump ran as a peace candidate, right? No more forever wars. I'm gonna, keep America out of these crazy, endless conflicts. He lied, right? Here we are again in another war, right? And you're right. Among whites who serve in the U.S. military, it's not a draft. It's a volunteer force. these are poor, working class whites from rural areas mostly, and especially the South. They're patriotic. I mean, you know, it's touching. You know, they don't know. They want to serve their country, right? But they're cannon fodder. They're just going to be sent to some war that makes no sense. So now they're finally sick of it. They're sick of it. And that's one reason why Trump won the Republican nomination. He promised no more wars, because it's those boys and girls who are the ones who get shot up. That said, the armed services is disproportionately black and brown, actually. But there are a lot of white working class, youth also who serve. And really, the United States Army is one of the few institutions in America that's genuinely integrated. And you know, it's actually in many ways a kind of praiseworthy example of integration. So anyway, they're mad, and actually, if you go to the New York Times website, you'll see opinion polls are showing that Trump's own base disagrees with this war in Iran. They don't support it. So Trump better get out pretty soon. He can't stay in it more than a month, I think, because his own base is going to revolt against him. So whatever his objective is, and I don't think he has an objective. I think he's crazy, right? But whatever it is, he better accomplish it within 3 to 4 weeks, I think.
Somebody else had their hand up.
Thank you very much. So I was just curious about the polar. I'm from California, so I'm curious about the polarization element in the political, left versus right. For me, I feel like a lot of what I've seen is that the left and the right are pretty much the same. They're just using a different language at this point to try and buy voter appeal. So when we say things like everybody who votes for Trump, racist, they're never going to change. I mean, we could just say the same thing about the left. Everyone who voted for Kamala loves killing Palestinian kids. It's just, I feel like that doesn't really get to the core of the issue. And I'm just curious about how we're going to get there, and if, how can we continue to try to believe that bipartisanship is possible? I mean, if people on the Republican side are so loyal that they'll never change, how did Talarico win Texas?
Well, he didn't win the general election. He won the Democratic primary, right?
Well, right, but he has. I mean, how is he getting so much support? We're seeing people who are traditionally Republican who are leaning more towards him now. I don't know. I just feel like it's messier than we want to think. And how can we kind of bring back? I don't know. Maybe it's a naive optimism that I have, but.
Well, there was a time when party affiliation didn't matter as much.
Right.
Going back 40 years ago, 50 years ago. But I don't think bipartisanship is going to come back anytime soon. So the important thing is not to try to understand MAGA. The important thing is to tame it and subdue it, basically. And that means win elections. And if they lose enough elections, the more sensible ones, maybe then we'll see, okay, this is futile, this is a dead end. Just like you had after 1932. The more sensible Republicans and Dixiecrats were like, okay, we're in the wilderness here, and I'm ambitious, and I'm not going to get anywhere unless I start playing ball with these Democrats. And you started having more, bipartisan cooperation. But the first step, in my opinion, is not to understand them. I understand them. I think they're a menace. You got to just beat them first. But that's the stick. The carrot would be if the Democrats govern the way FDR governed, and they actually deliver the economic goods and actually raise living standards for regular Americans, you'll start to win over some of those white working class Americans, I think. Just the way FDR did, right? But you got to deliver. And the Democrats have not delivered in a long time. Clinton, Obama, they didn't deliver. They didn't deliver. Living standards got worse for average Americans. And, Bill Clinton would raise the minimum wage by 50 cents. That doesn't get it done, these little micro initiatives. I'm talking about like a major redistribution of wealth that will significantly hoist living standards, and so that the top 1% doesn't just keep taking all the fruits of economic growth. So I guess I disagree with your premise that cooperation is possible anytime now. In the long run, though, I could see more bipartisanship, but only if the Democrats govern and only if they deliver. And right now, they're doing neither. So right now, it's two parties at parity. You can't win over any Republicans to vote for you. You can't get conservative-leaning independents either to vote for you. You got to turn out your own base. Once you're in power, then you got to deliver. So maybe we kind of view it differently, I think.
Other questions? If not, I might abuse my privilege as chair to also ask a question. Thanks so much for sort of covering a wide amount of responses to the questions that have been asked, and obviously for the talk itself. So one of the things that came up from the discussion so far, and sort of relating to your final discussion regarding how to defeat Trumpism, is it possible to defeat Trumpism and other kind of populist movements when at the very heart of all of these movements are grand lies, right? So at the end of the day, as you were saying yourself, essentially lots of political parties, mainstream establishment political parties go into a knife fight with their fists, essentially, by actually following the rules, by actually following the law, by actually not lying. So how can we actually mount effective political campaigns when essentially we're fighting movements that have no basis in truth, right? Like everything is essentially a strategic lie in order to win votes. So, for example, as you were saying yourself, Trump ran on a platform of peace, like he will be the peace president. That was clearly a lie. There's the kind of constant hand-wringing by right-wing political parties about questions of immigration, whereby more often than not, the statistics that they're making up with regards to they're all criminals, they're all sort of doing something horrible, they're stealing our jobs, they're all lies, right? So how do we tackle this problem while still maintaining kind of this commitment to the truth? Because I think the solution isn't that we fight fire with fire and start lying ourselves. I don't think that's fundamentally a good thing to do from a moral perspective, but also can we build a sustainable political settlement on the basis of lies? I don't think so. So how do we... It's not an easy question to answer, but I was just curious about your thoughts as someone who has sort of done this kind of work before.
Yeah, you know, Michelle Obama has a famous saying, when they go low, we go high. Well, I don't agree with that. But on the other hand, I also agree with you that we don't want to just become liars, right? And putschists, right? I mean, we can't go as low as they did. But I think we need to go a little lower. We got to play what Americans call hardball. What would be an example of that? Well, for one thing, we got to really focus on elections. Our resources have to go into elections and less into intellectual policy analysis. We have to win elections. And secondly, when we're in power, we got to use all the power that's legal to lock in a Democratic majority. So, for example, it was considered absolutely out of bounds until just a year ago, 2 years ago, to enlarge the Supreme Court. But in fact, it's not against the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't specify the number of seats in the Supreme Court. That's an example of hardball, right? Really just using all the available levers available and departing from norms. How about this? Departing from norms. Democrats ought to depart from norms. I don't think they should lie. I don't think they should definitely not break any laws. But they have to start departing from norms and realize this is not a gentlemanly situation we're in. Here's an example. Merrick Garland, perfect example. Attorney General Merrick Garland. He's an example of the problem, right? He didn't investigate Donald Trump for the 2 broad daylight crimes he committed, right? January 6th, he waited 2 years to launch the independent counsel. 2 years. I mean, why would it take that long? And he also didn't prosecute Trump in any aggressive way, or it took a long time when Trump stole all those classified documents, even though this is in broad daylight. Why? Because Garland is of that school of like, oh, they go low, but we go high. We can't prosecute a political opponent. You can't Justice Department, that would be unseemly somehow, right? You gotta dispense that kind of thinking. It has to be like, no, he broke the law. We don't care. He broke the law. We're going to prosecute him. They just have to toughen up. You have to toughen up. But you're right. There's a certain point where you can't go too low. And I think that the bright line is lies, flat out lies that you know are lies, breaking the law or violating the Constitution. But short of those 3 things, absolutely, you know.
All right. right, any final questions, or we can collect some, please?
But about speaking about lies, the fact that the Democrats can be win the next election, in many cases the last shot, because if I completely agree with you that it's necessary a great redistribution of the wealth, but if the Democrats will be not able to do that, even if they will win the next election, will be not the end like and definitely win of the trumpisme and in general the far right and the neoliberalization transformation in the history of America.
Yeah, I mean, right now the stakes just couldn't be higher. They cannot lose that election, and that'd be another way of thinking about it. We cannot lose this election. You know, and so they should be acting like that. It's not an option. We have to win, and we'll do everything short of breaking the law or violating the Constitution.
Even if they win, they will the Democrat Party will be able to do the redistribution of the wealth.
Well, if they win Congress, and the White House at the same time, yeah, you can do a lot. And there have been examples where Democrats had control of Congress and the White House, but because they're just so kind of wussy about it, they didn't just ram through their agenda. You know, they would debate too long. They would agree to rules that required supermajority, for example. No more supermajorities. Let's pass things by simple majority. They would never even consider adding new seats to the Supreme Court, things like that. So they have to rethink all that. And above all, the default setting should be aggression. Default setting, aggression. And let's err on the side of being too aggressive. That's because that's what we're up against. We're up against an opponent who's ruthless.
All right, we can take two final questions. So maybe we'll just take the questions and then Sean can respond and we'll close out so that we can sort of finish off the session. So you go ahead first and then we'll get to...
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. No, I was interested by these last comments that you made about the cautiousness, let's call it this way, of the Democrats and of the leftist part of American politics in not running through their agenda. And it's very interesting to me as an European, as an Italian, because we can see lots of, in Italy first of all, with the leftist side, this cautiousness is really counterproductive. Not running through, not exploiting all the instruments to pursue your agenda against a player that plays against the rules. And so I just wanted to ask in a general, in a broader way, where do you think this comes from? Where do you think this not being able to exploit the instrument at your disposal to counter someone else, where do you think this comes from?
Actually, my wife wrote a whole book on that very topic. Conservatives in general are more comfortable with power, and they like it more, you know, and they're more ruthless in the pursuit of it. And it's kind of mystery, actually. There's a psychological thing on the left of like, we're not quite comfortable with power. Power is somehow bad. I'm nervous about it, and they become very fussy about process, you know. So anyway, we got to get over that, you know. You know, the stakes are too high here. If the United States goes off the rails, we're all screwed, basically, right? It's the world's only superpower, becomes a permanent rogue actor on the global stage. Everyone in this room is basically screwed. It's going to be chaos, right? So the stakes are just too high. We have to stop being so fussy, and we just have to win, and then when we're in power, do what it takes to enact our agenda. You all have a role to play as well, getting tough with the United States and showing Republican elites that Trumpism doesn't work. It's backfiring. They're losing foreign markets, and hopefully that will also help. You know, because Trump is going to have to retire now. He cannot serve another term. So once he's off the stage, his peculiar charismatic personality is no longer a factor, really. And at that point, Republican elites maybe can kind of push the party back in a more reasonable direction. But, you know, part of that will be Europeans inflicting pain on them to show them that their trade war and their love of Putin is not working out for them.
Thank you.
Maybe just to wrap up, a view of the 2026 elections, will they happen? And if so, what's going to happen?
Yeah, Yeah, it'll be tough for, Trump can't cancel them, he just can't. The elections are administered at the state level, those are state governments that control each election in their own state. However, he could send ICE agents to intimidate voters in of-color precincts, that sort of thing, but he can't cancel the election. And all the indications are, and this gets back to my point before, the overall situation in the United States is parity. They don't have the upper hand, it's dead even. So they just won the last election, we're gonna win this one. The only question is by how much. But the Democrats will take back at least one House of Congress, at least, and maybe both. And even if Trump breaks the rules, I don't think he can stop Democrats taking back at least one House of Congress. If they just, they attempted a coup d'etat on January 6th. So they are capable of attempting that sort of thing. If they do it again, it'll be more professional. And at that point, the key variable will be the Democrats and all Americans who care about rule of law, are they willing to go in the street and put their body on the line? And that's what's going to decide it at that point. So let's hope it doesn't come to that. But at this point, it wouldn't surprise me, actually, And if it does come to that, I'm going to get an airplane and go back, because I don't want to be there.
All right, on that note, I guess we can wrap up. Please join me in thanking Sean again for this very interesting, illuminating discussion.
Oh, thank you.
All right, we can check
Oh, yeah.
maybe your phone is still running, or
Yeah,
it's
well, I guess
fallen
I'll
asleep.
find out.
Ah.
Oh, good, it's still running?
Yes, but I don't know if I should click pause or stop, so I'll let you.
Oh, you got it, yeah, that's it.
Oh, it's still going.
Oh, yeah.
Gotta hit the stop button.
Yeah.